Parliament Funkadelic fame, urged folks to paint the White House black. And it seems that what once was this kind of hip-hop fantasy became a reality when Barack Obama became president. And in the wake of the election of President Obama, there's been a lot of discussion these days as to whether or not this event, the fact that a black man, or part black man, now occupies the highest political office in the land, suggests that somehow we've moved away from race, that we are now a post-racial society, and that the dream of colorblindness has somehow been historically achieved. I had this quote too. I love this. It was after Obama's State of the Union speech in January, in late January, that MSNBC Chris Matthews said, quote, "He's post-racial by all appearances. I forgot he was black tonight for an hour." I think the point is a whole hour. I think before we engage in this kind of post-racial celebration, it's important to realize that despite this achievement, that nonetheless structural forms of racism do persist in our society. Everything from the toxic waste dumping to the war on terror to indeed the whole subprime home mortgage rate crisis has a distinctly racial dimension to it. And so that these structural forms of racism really haven't disappeared. It kind of reminds me of another, once Malcolm X was asked by a reporter that given the passage of civil rights legislation, doesn't this mean that things are improving for blacks? And Malcolm X said, it does no good to shove a knife 9 inches into someone, pull it out 6 inches, and then call it progress. And there's ways, in fact, I think that some people don't even want to admit the knife is there. That, in fact, in the kind of popular discourse, we see a lot of attention being paid to color blindness. The belief that with the significant passage of civil rights laws, that now racism is no longer, racial inequality is no longer a problem, that we've moved beyond this in some fashion. And indeed, that the best anti-racist gesture, policy, or practice is simply to ignore race. We don't see race. In other words, it's I can hear this in the classroom a lot from students who say, I don't see race. I don't care for persons, white, black, yellow. They usually throw in a few other weird colors like green and purple in there too. I just see the person. And so there's a kind of denial that race in many respects, and I think we'll hear this from some of the other panelists, really informs and shapes our perceptions and how we operate in the world. Race, the exhibit itself, was meant to sort of talk about some of these issues, mainly to talk about the concept of race itself and how the history of kind of race science, the kinds of ways in which race forms a kind of lived experience, the ways people experience that on a kind of day-to-day, very personal level. And explore some of those contradictions. I mean, I learned a lot on being on the advisory board for the exhibit. I was a sort of token sociologist. There was a token historian, there was a token sociologist, and mostly anthropologists. And there's a couple of things that struck me about the exhibit itself. One was that academics had no idea of how to make a museum exhibit. That was the first thing. And really took the Science Museum folks at Minnesota to really transform these ideas into a concrete exhibit. But the other thing I learned, and we were trying to emphasize, was that race was not a biological concept, and to critique that. But some of us worried that if you just talked about that in a display, people would come away from the exhibit thinking, yeah, that's right, race doesn't matter. Therefore, we should be colorblind because there's no reality to race in some ways. So the other part of the exhibit, which was the attempt by some of us to emphasize, was the social dimensions of race. That race might not be a biological thing, but it is a social, real thing that structures our experiences or our institutional encounters as well. And that was something that we tried to sort of drive home. So if you look at the exhibit, there are these different tracks. There's kind of a science, biology track to it. There's a kind of history of race track to it. There's a kind of lived experience track to it as well. Now, I'm just going to say that one of the questions that I think comes out of that might be worth discussing is what do we mean when we're trying to challenge racial inequality to be colorblind? And what does it mean to be color conscious in terms of our policies and our practices? And this is coming at a particular kind of important historical moment as well. Within some of the genomic sciences, there's a kind of renewed debate as to whether or not race does have a biological or genetic meaning to it. Many of you might be familiar in the field of pharmacogenomics, for example. There's been the release of ethnic designer drugs that are targeted towards specific populations. The first was Nitromed's Bidil, which is being marketed towards African Americans who suffer from congestive heart failure. We could go into this, but it's really interesting because it could be an interesting marketing ploy too, where in fact some of these medications work across the color lines, but nonetheless they're being seen as what the argument is being made is that race in some way does act as a handy proxy for figuring out a person's susceptibility to certain kinds of diseases and the types of medications or medical interventions that that person can receive. Also, many of you have been watching some of these series on PBS. Skip Gates, Henry Louis Gates Jr. has a whole series looking at one's ancestral roots through mitochondrial DNA testing. And it's led to this proliferation of folks out there who are trying to trace their ancestral roots through these forms of genetic testings. There's a lot of issues and problems with them. But nonetheless, you know, through Oprah, through Skip Gates, there's been a real resurgence of interest in seeing this, and in which case race is definitely seen as a kind of biological category. The other thing I'll mention that's a big debate is that there's currently a big debate about racial data as a whole, whether or not we should keep this data. And the most current expression of this is that there was a kind of a boycott circulating around Census 2010 that had the backing of several members of Congress who were trying to argue that this was too intrusive on the government's part, even though it's 10 questions, and that people should just fill out the number of people who reside in the household and not answer particularly the race and data questions that are attached to it. And this, of course, comes in the wake of initiatives like, I'm sure people remember here in 2003, we had California's Proposition 54, which was sponsored by former UC Regent Ward Connolly, which was going to have an amendment in the state's constitution which forbid the state from engaging in any form of racial record keeping and data collection. Ward Connolly suggests that any transition to a colorblind society needs to be premised on getting rid of the racial categories themselves. So one of the interesting things in which he's talking about is the ways in which he says that racial categories have been historically used to disenfranchise groups. And somehow with this belief that if we got rid of the categories themselves, that would speed us along towards this colorblind ideal. Real problems attached to all these things. And in fact, I think what we want to look at is the instances, the ways in which we engage in a form of color blindness selectively, and the ways in which we promote color consciousness and towards what ends. And I think that issue about towards what ends becomes really crucial for the debate going forward. So let me just stop there and turn it over.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, next we'll have Frank Worrell. He's a professor